G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Today's episode is supported by Audible and is presenting Loops, a gripping, wildly unpredictable new audio drama performed by an all-star cast led by Vivica Fox and Teresa Ruiz. Presented in a found audio style, Loops blends thriller, mystery, and psychological horror, and a jaw-dropping ending that will have you replaying sections for revealing clues. The story touches on real-life issues of marginalized voices and border crimes. Additional cast also includes Feliz Ramirez of Grand Hotel, Yul Vasquez of Russian Doll, Antonio Yaramillo of Mayans MC, and Carlos Santos of Hentified. Head to audible.com/loops to start listening today. That's audible.com/loops. Back in 2016, my friends and I for the longest time had been itching to go camping to our local camping site in the Los Padres National Park in Southern California. When we found the perfect weekend to go that didn't interfere with any of our work schedules, we set the date. 3 days before the trip, we found out that we were going to get hit by the El Nino rainstorm. Us, being the type of dudes that we are though, didn't care if we got hit by the storm while camping. So we backed up our cars and made the 45-minute drive to the campsite. The campsite was a family-friendly one where there were about 100 camping lots that circled around the clearing in the forest. We found the perfect spot that was underneath huge thick trees that should help block out as much rain as possible, and it helped out that the restrooms were only like 30 yards away too. Now, as soon as we got to our spot, we took advantage of the afternoon sky being cleared for the moment, and we rushed to set up our spot. The layout that we did was that we pitched our tents close by, where our tent doors were only 6 feet apart. The reason why we did this too is because, in order to combat the rain, I bought a 30-foot by 30-foot thick blue canopy top that I threw over to cover us from the rain above, and from the rain that would be running through the ground as well. In hindsight, it was a genius move on my part. What this meant is that whenever you walked around the tent, you would be making heaps of noise from crunching through the plastic top. Anyway, hours passed and we're all around the campfire. It was late in the evening, and this was the first time that I noticed that there were barely any other campers. They were mainly camping in their RVs, like the fake campers that they seemed to be. In honest opinion too, they were the smart ones really, unlike my friends and I that were sleeping in 2 small tents, with our only protection being the blue tarp. I was getting tired from a long day at work though, and I decided that I was going off to knock out. My friends followed my lead as well because they were getting pretty tired too. The way that the sleeping arrangements were was that I had my friend Ray sleeping in my tent, and AJ and S were sleeping in theirs. Before I called it a night though, I whispered to Ray and told him I'm going to prank call S and AJ, but I'm not going to say anything. Ray smiled as I dialed my friends up. I called them on restricted, and S's phone started to ring off. Both of them, being the way that they are, got timid very easily, and they said to one another, "Who's calling you this late at night?" "I don't know, they called me unrestricted." "Are you going to answer?" "Of course not." Ray and I were holding our laughter as they ignored our call. I decided to do it one more time too. And once their phones started to ring, they started to freak out once again, and they said, "Who is it this time?" "The same person, I think." "I'm going to answer." And as they did answer, S said in a very shaky tone, "Hello." Ray and I had to hold in our laughter as we kept as quiet as possible, but not wanting to make any noises that would give off that it was actually us. I held the phone close to my mouth as I began to breathe heavily in a sort of murderous way. I ended the call, and just hearing them freak out the way that they did was making my night much more fun. Me being the idiot that I am, I called them one more time, and this time S picked up the phone immediately and said in a tough voice, "Look, whoever this is, they better stop. I'm about to call the cops if you keep on calling. This is not a threat." Ray and I looked at each other as we, at the same time, began to fake moan as loud and immediately started to bawl out in laughter. AJ and S were so mad at us for pulling this prank on us, and they were cursing us out. We, finally calming down from laughing so loudly, eventually told the boys. I told them good night, and I told them that I'd make up for it by making them pancakes and have it ready in the morning. Since I fell asleep relatively easily too, I was out in a matter of minutes, while Ray, AJ and S were up for a while longer. I was the first of the friends to wake up in the morning, and as I promised, I had the pancakes ready cooking by the time that anybody else woke up. The smell of my cooking woke my friends up, and one by one they got out of their tents. As we were eating, AJ spoke up and said, "Hey Jay, that prank that you pulled last night went a little too far. Yeah, you had us ready to run out to the car and take off." Me, feeling a bit guilty, apologized and said, "Sorry guys, my bad. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to prank call us like that, but then to walk around our tent and then go inside it in the middle of the night is totally out of limits," S said. Me, not knowing what they were talking about now, said, "What do you guys mean?" "Now, come on, still with the jokes? You were the one that was walking around our tent and you walked in." Ray spoke up and said, "That wasn't Jay who was walking around. I thought that was you two getting your revenge on us for scaring you. That wasn't us doing that. It was you two." So, to explain, after I fell asleep, about maybe an hour had passed where Ray, S and AJ were still up and all was quiet in the forest, until the sounds of footsteps were heard stepping on our blue tarp that was on the ground. At first, my friends thought that it could have just been a forest animal wandering around, but the heavy footsteps were a dead giveaway that it was a person. As they described, the person was walking all around our tents, making constant figure eights, sort of. The person would place their fingers on the tent's fabric walls to run them up and down. The footsteps finally stopped after a couple of minutes, right in between our tent doors. The three of them were already having their hearts pounding out of their chest. It was silent for a long time, until the sound of the tent's zipper slid open. As AJ says, the tent's door was only sort of halfway open, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. But in the darkness, both S and AJ saw the silhouette of a man's face pop his head into the tent to look at both of them. AJ and S faked being asleep the entire time, but they kept their eyes locked onto the man. The man then opened the tent fully and walked inside the tent, just standing at the entrance. The man didn't say a word or do anything, just sort of watched the both of them laying in their sleeping bags. After a long minute, the man just took his steps out of the tent and his footsteps were heard walking away, disappearing into the night. The entire time that this was happening, S and AJ thought that it was either me or Ray doing this, and Ray thought it was either AJ or S doing this. Back to us arguing back and forth at the breakfast table, we were interrupted by a man walking to our campsite and he said, "Good morning, boys. How did the four of you sleep last night?" This man spoke in a smoker's voice too, as if he'd been going at it for like 45 years of being alive. He wore a dirty, sweat-stained white t-shirt that looked more grey at this point, and his blue jeans looked like they'd never been taken off. He smelt like liquor, not a good sign at 8 in the morning, mind you, and his words were just sort of mumbling around. We didn't say a word to this guy, as he then asked us if we had any cigarettes to spare him. I said that we didn't smoke, and he said, "Oh, well, if you boys want to visit me in my RV, just stop by anytime." The man continued to walk away towards the restrooms, and as he was done using it, he walked back to our campsite again. He didn't say anything this time, but he looked at us and gave us a nearly toothless smile, and then he just walked back to his RV. I took note of his RV, as it was the only RV that was stuck out as being dirty and more rundown than the others, but we quickly summed up the man as the person who was walking around our tents last night, and S and AJ now remembered that they also smelt liquor from the person who was standing in their tent. We all agreed that we would keep an extra eye out on this guy, and if he did spend another night, that we would most likely report him to the park rangers if he tried anything else. It was around lunchtime now, and the man came back, not to use the restroom, but just to talk to us. "So, are any of you boys interested in buying an RV? You all can go check it out right now and see if you want to buy it. I don't need it anymore since my wife left me. But just check out the inside of the RV, man." No, we don't need one. We're good," I said with a visible threatening tone. The man seemed to notice this, and he walked away again. The man ended up leaving a few hours before sunset, but the entire time that he was there, he just kept glancing at us. Mind you, the man had his RV about 50 yards away from us, and I noticed that he had a restroom right next to his RV too. So why did he make any effort in walking all the way over to our campsite just to use our restroom? Also, why did he even use ours if RVs come with restrooms installed in them, right? Whatever the man wanted, we were just glad that we were about to enjoy the rest of our weekend without him. So this isn't my story, it's actually my dad's. Around 40 years ago, when my dad was still in college, he moved quite a ways from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam to New Haven, Connecticut for college. He had already received the Form I-20 and went to the consular at the US Embassy to try and get an M student visa. He was a first-generation immigrant, and though he had taken a fair amount of English classes in Vietnam, he wasn't fluent and knew nothing about housing in America and all that stuff. This is why he went the cheap route and rented out an apartment somewhere near Pine Tree Drive in West Haven. His landlord, as he told me later, gave off some serious red flags though that he sort of brushed off because the apartment was only $250 a month. Now firstly, the landlord's abode was directly next door to that of my dad's, and during his first night there, while he was getting unpacked, he heard a high-pitched screeching and a sort of weird opera music. Again, he brushed it off for the same reason I said earlier, and also because he was very tired. The next morning, when he awoke, he noticed a chair by his bed that wasn't there before though, and when he went to the bathroom, his toilet seat was up, though he recalled putting it down, and not only that, his door was unlocked. He again brushed it off though because he didn't want to stir up anything with his landlord by asking if he had come into his room, or by asking if he had been broken into, therein referring that the apartment was insecure. He also wanted to explore West Haven as his college year didn't begin until late August. He had come 3 weeks early, and as he left, he specifically remembered locking his door behind him. But when he returned after a few hours out, he noticed that not only had the door been unlocked, but it was actually slightly ajar. This went on for weeks until his college year began, and things slightly moved from where he had left them, and articles of food were missing from his fridge, and other weird stuff like this. Finally, though, my dad had had enough, and one night he decided to stay awake until very late and try to catch whoever was doing this red-handed. That night, he finished his homework and then got into bed, but he laid there and just remained awake. And sure enough, at around 2 in the morning, he sees his door handle turning and a hand sliding through. My dad froze, his blood ran cold, and he then saw the landlord creep in and take some eggs from the fridge. But not only that, the landlord then went to the bathroom, coming out a couple of minutes afterwards, and he then slipped out once again, leaving the door unlocked. This creeped my dad out big time, which is understandable, right? But for some stupid reason, he still decided to stay at the apartment for a few more nights before he finally confronted the landlord. Money and wanting to save does some stupid things to the brain, I guess. But this was before mobile phones and even decent cameras that didn't cost like $100+, and so my dad had literally no way to get evidence to show to the cops besides mere accusations. The next night, he once again heard the odd screeching and weird opera music coming from his landlord's room, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. That weekend, when his landlord went out shopping, he broke into his landlord's room, and what he found there was seriously disturbing. First of all, he found some sort of weird sex doll, but when he investigated further, he found an old Kodak camera, and under this was some extremely low-quality pictures of my dad in bed sleeping. Well, he noped out of there real quick, taking the pictures with him, and went to the police station. He moved out of there shortly after, and he later heard that This same landlord had scared other residents off the apartment after hearing the odd screeching and opera music, and after seeing all of their things moved around like he did. The building my dad lived in was since torn down, and my dad decided to just dorm at Sigma Chi. He had at first opted to stay away from fraternities because of the heavy partying and stuff like that, but in the end he just decided to put up with it. We never knew what happened to the landlord, only that he would be facing some prison time, and I seriously hope that he was never allowed to be a landlord again because, man, that is creepy. I work in food service, front of house, so in the early days of the pandemic with restaurants closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing and stuff like that. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people, so I jumped at the opportunity right away. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest gig that I'd been offered thus far, COVID-wise anyway. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could, due to crowds obviously, so decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area, and I really didn't want a virus. So I headed in at almost 3 a.m. because it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious though, because I was exhausted. I stumbled onto the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up asking Uber, while I cluelessly wandered up and down the street searching. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not that familiar with all of the surrounding areas and thought nothing of it. I was pretty alert at first, so was trying to pass the time playing games on my phone and stuff. But the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one either, so I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down into airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. I don't often take ride shares, so being alone with a strange driver often did put me on edge, but this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother even, I think. Young, clean-kept, listening to jazz, nothing that screamed, you need to micromanage this trip. When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep and couldn't fully distinguish it from my dream. Finally, though, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, ma'am, we're here now. I was embarrassed that I'd been out of it, so I just gave a hurried thanks and booked it out of the car and into the building. But as I looked around, I began to realize that nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it had appeared to be a sort of strip mall plaza. And the further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. I expected some lights to be off in the nighttime, of course, but not the whole building like this. I skidded across the concrete foundation comprising what was left of the lobby area, told myself that they must be renovating or something, and followed the signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages, but was likely just a few minutes, all I had passed was construction equipment, a couple of locked doors, and some smashed windows. I was certain that I was not going to find a medical office and figured that maybe I had mixed up the address or something. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of the aeroplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my text that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service, but since I'd only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured that I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair that he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling a second trip, considering this was all his mix-up after all. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell that I was aware of was the one that I had taken up, so it would force me into the middle of the building, and there was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, that was for sure, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help get me off the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night, and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride too, but the message just wasn't sending. The reception was too weak. So I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell, or even window with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort, in the event that whoever was downstairs came upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated, and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst case scenario began to unfold, because I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured that, based on the walk about the floor, that it was basically a giant loop, so what I would have to do is wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way in, and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going, and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but didn't want to anger off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I'd trespassed and become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park like this. So I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, I would guess, but it was probably just close to 30 seconds. And the person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief too, it was just the Uber driver. I figured that he would have come back for me, realizing that he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So I came out from the beam that I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed that there was no way for him to realize that this had been the wrong address. And at that, my stomach lurched forward and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons that he might have returned, but in that moment, standing across from him like that, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much from the ensuing few minutes, but operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just sort of let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think that he saw where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken, thankfully. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was too dark to tell. I was so disorientated from the fall too, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew that it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, though, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, there's another one of these guys, and I stumbled backwards trying to find something to hide behind. But before I could, a voice called out, "All right, this is the police. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe that it was the police at first. I was in such a fight or flight mode and had already committed to flight that I continued to look for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "Hey, I said on the ground right now. Hands out where I can see them." He sounded so authoritative that I just sort of automatically did exactly as he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see that he was really a police officer. First, he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what had just happened and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into my being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He was even asking me questions like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke or cut me? Would you rather talk in here or outside?" And my totally stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe that I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. And the first thing that I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? Or what did they tell you?" And he explained no, nobody called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned, and nobody's supposed to be inside, and when they're there, they're not up to no good. He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, that he had resources that he could direct me to, and that this was not an ideal place to do either of these things, and asking if I had somewhere safe to stay that night. But I was stuck on something else that he'd said. Finally, it all clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. He looked around and, unfortunately, the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed that the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building, and he asked me all the details that I remembered, and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much, but the officer realized that I could pull up my Uber app and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there, even outdoors, so we quickly sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life, and I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. They said, "Hello, I've arrived, and I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" And I'm flashing my hazards. And finally, unfortunately, your driver had to cancel. At first I thought that the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and cancelling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing that I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off, and exonerating himself. But instead I checked the car details, checked again, and I noticed that it definitely was not the same driver. What I mean is that the person who had driven me here, they had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to get me. The police took my statement and said that they would keep an eye out for the guy, but the best that I could give them to go off of was basically young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, goatee, and 4-door sedan, wearing a zip-up sweatshirt, maybe had a hood, which is like 1 out of every 4 guys in this city. In the end, though, I feel very fortunate to have survived this near miss. Suffice it to say, too, I do not take rideshare services anymore. When I was 13, my family moved into a home in a nice neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona. It was a relatively new build, 2002, and was a part of a very nice subdivision. I lived in the house from the age of roughly 13 to 19. There was a year in college dorms in the middle. No one had passed away in the house, that I could find anyway, and overall, it didn't have any of those sort of haunted house red flags or anything. Also, for context, although I am currently not very religious, I grew up in an extremely Christian religious family. So the entire time that I lived in this house, I had horrible nightmares, to the point where I was scared to go to sleep. My parents would sort of play it off like it was nothing. My parents were on one side of the house and had their own bathroom. On my side of the house, it was just me and no one used my bathroom. And at night, I would hear the sink was on and the toilet was flushing. But no one was ever in the bathroom when I looked, and I tried to play it off like it was nothing. I would also hear scratching in the attic relatively frequently. My childhood house had a stray cat that lived in our attic, so I quickly explained that away as likely some sort of an animal, even though it was a newer house with a sealed attic and we never found any animals. I thought all of this was happening to me, but eventually my mum and dad started talking about footsteps that they heard at night. My mum said that they would walk around the house, but she didn't feel any negative energy, so she thought that maybe it was an angel or deceased loved one protecting us. Insert eye roll here at the angel comment, but my dad said the footsteps happened every night. And I stayed awake one night, and yeah, it sounded like someone shuffling through the house. Now, all of this seemed like pretty harmless activity, until one night in my late teens. It was on this night that I woke up to find my bedroom door closed. I had a mirror on the back of my bedroom door, and I always was afraid of seeing something in that mirror, so I kept the door open and the hall light on. Everyone in the house knew about my obsession with keeping the door open, and later, when I asked about it, no one in my family said that they shut my door. Upon seeing the door shut, though, I immediately panicked. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and tried not to look in the mirror. I opened the door, took a deep breath, and I walked back to my bed. I remember thinking something like, this is the part of the horror movie where I get attacked, right? And then I laid my head down on my bed. Now, I know this next part people are going to call fake and say it didn't happen, but I know without a shadow of a doubt that this happened to me, and I can't explain it to save my life. So the second that I laid down my head, it was like the covers were just pulled up over my face and someone was holding them down over my head. It honestly felt like hands were all over my body, pinning me down, and I felt like I was burning all over too, and I could hear the sound of like firewood burning in my ears or something like that. I could also hear like something like laughing, and I couldn't move, and I felt like I was about to die. Regardless of your views on religion too, all I could think to do at the time was just pray. I don't know if I prayed out loud or really loud in my head or something, but I said something like, "In the name of Jesus, stop," 3 times. I remember very specifically on the 3rd time too, everything just all of a sudden evaporated. My house was quiet, there was nothing holding me down any longer, and I just ran. I bolted into my parents' room, covered in sweat and sobbing. My dad said that it was just a nightmare, but I got angry and yelled at him for not listening to me this time. I wouldn't go back into my room, and my mum took it a little more seriously, thankfully. The next day, she had the house anointed, or whatever it's called, and prayed over. And after that, everything stopped. The footsteps, the nightmares, the toilet flushing, everything. We did eventually move out of that house, and nothing like that ever happened again, thankfully, but it seems that everywhere I go since then, weird stuff still happens to me, sort of periodically, but not at that scale, that's for sure. Like I said, I'm not super religious anymore, but this is one of those things that I just really can't explain. I can't offer any logical explanation for what happened. All I know is that it did. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Today's episode is supported by Audible and is presenting Loops, a gripping, wildly unpredictable new audio drama performed by an all-star cast led by Vivica Fox and Teresa Ruiz. Presented in a found audio style, Loops blends thriller, mystery, and psychological horror, and a jaw-dropping ending that will have you replaying sections for revealing clues. The story touches on real-life issues of marginalized voices and border crimes. Additional cast also includes Feliz Ramirez of Grand Hotel, Yul Vasquez of Russian Doll, Antonio Yaramillo of Mayans MC, and Carlos Santos of Hentified. Head to audible.com/loops to start listening today. That's audible.com/loops. When I was in college, I found myself Ubering to make some money. This was in Southern California, and LA at the time was a constant flow of work. Occasionally, you would pick up people in a nice area and they would tell you that they were sleeping with someone in a relationship or that they themselves were cheating. This was actually pretty depressingly common as well. I think that saying what they were doing to someone, which happened to be me at the time, gave them some sort of a weird kind of relief. But once I drove from Hollywood to Hemet, CA, he was very charming and funny, and when I dropped him off, it was at a big blue building, but they buzzed us into it. He left me a $200 cash tip, and I later found out that this was known as Gold Base for the Church of Scientology. If you don't know what that is, it's a completely normal, not weird at all in any way, location owned by the Church of Scientology. Feel free to Google it. A few months into my taxi career, though, insurance companies started using rideshare service, and some people who were more down on their luck would use it. Sometimes this was people just trying to get their kids to school, but sometimes it was much sadder things. I honestly cannot tell you how many times I've showed up to a doctor's office to see someone with accessibility limitations face drop at seeing my tiny car instead of a van like they needed. The people with substance problems were interactions that would stay with you. But once I picked up a man going to a dental appointment, and I drove him for about half an hour. He told me about how he used to run drugs in the 90s until they caught him with a few pounds of coke. He told me about when he was moved from Nevada to Florida for trial, how he traveled handcuffed in a van, how the cops would stop only once a day at McDonald's and for their own dollar menu item of the day. And then he asked me to stop at a liquor store that he chugged a tiny bottle of booze, shoved mints into his mouth, and then sipped on some soda. And he smelled like pure alcohol when I dropped him off at the dentist. Near my house there was a methadone clinic too. I would get up before dawn to be able to take those rides. Early bird gets the worm, right? Almost always they were sweet and thankful, but sometimes they were just a little bit out of it, but I never felt in danger or anything like that. Just good people going through tough times, right? But these rides were the most consistently depressing. People who were going to court clearly drunk or high, older women who had trouble requesting a ride and had been waiting in the parking lot of their dialysis place in the night. They'd tell their story sometimes, and a person who was going to court for a child custody case or something, people struggling with mental illness. Some mornings were honestly exhausting too, listening to these things. But being up that early, you would also hit another crowd that I had never anticipated. Funeral goers. The saddest funeral ride was when a man and a woman got into the back seat, and rather than speaking to me, the man handed me a neon printout of a map of a cemetery with instructions on what plot to go to, with, "Hello, I'm attending my father's funeral. My wife and I are deaf. Please follow these directions," written on the back of it. The whole ride there, I could hear them signing to one another and trying not to cry. And then there were also the retired gamblers. They'd leave their houses at like 7 in the morning, take a $70 Uber out to the desert, and spend the whole day gambling at the reservation casinos. And the desert is definitely where I saw the weirdest things. The desert was the only place that I ever felt truly scared driving. It was in Temecula, the wine country of SoCal, lots of wooded roads and deserts and whatnot. I picked up a lady just off the freeway at what I initially assumed was the edge of a golf resort, but it was actually an unpaved access road. It was late, and that area was especially dark. I was getting ready to call the passenger, and I saw them coming down the unpaved access road. It was a tall blonde woman in a very nice pantsuit. She was absurdly put together considering that she walked God knows how long in heels down a dirt road track. She got in the car, though, and it was very pleasant. She said that she lived in a gated community that was hard to get Ubers to, and it was easier to send me to the access road. I thought that was a bit weird, but I didn't want to be creepy asking about where she lived. She was friendly, chatty even. She was going to a dinner party, and as she spoke to me, I could feel her looking at me in the rearview mirror the entire ride. We drove about half an hour away from the freeway, though, to one of those rural chick neighborhoods that you would hear celebrities had huge parties at. Eventually, we reached the address, which was a paved road lined with trees. She told me to keep driving, and I didn't think much of it because, again, we were in a mansion-style neighborhood. And then we hit a white ranch-style fence after a minute or so going down the road. And it was right around that point was when I started to feel a bit uneasy. There were around a dozen no trespassing signs, and one of those classic forget the dog, beware of the owner signs, with a guy pointing a pistol at you. I thought it was more than a little blunt to have that many signs, but hey, not my property, right? So we drove for about a minute when we came to another fence. It was at the top of a hill and it overlooked a barn with some lights in the distance. And I know that this is going to sound weird, but it was just really unpleasant. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was just a barn with what looked like a barbecue going on, but being out in the woods without any light had really freaked me out. The passenger told me that I could just slide the gate open, and as I approached the fence, I then saw some signs that made me stop cold. Off to the side of the gate, not quite in the dark, but on the fringes of my headlights, there were metal signs with bullet holes through them, swastikas, and Confederate flags brightly displayed. SoCal has a lot of white supremacist pockets. I dropped off dozens of passengers in cities like Norco and driven down streets with people drinking in the garage and a Nazi flag proudly hung behind them. It wasn't my favorite, but I wasn't spending any time in those neighborhoods more than I needed to anyway. But this, for some reason, was just different though. It was after 11 p.m. at night and I had no idea where I was. I opened the gate, and down the road I saw what I assume were cell phone flashlights lighting up and coming up the incline. This made me pretty uncomfortable, and I went back and I told the woman that I didn't think my car could make it back up the hill if I went down it. She said, "What are you talking about? Just take me. It's right there." She was getting more heated, and I could see the lights slowly making their way up the hill. She kept telling me that I needed to cancel the ride then and that she wouldn't pay to not be taken the entire way. I told her the pin that I was supposed to take her to was like a mile back up the road, but I was so nervous that in the end I just relented and I cancelled. She slammed the door as she got out and I took off before I could see the cell phone light people get closer. The road back was much rougher at the speed that I was going at, and I felt a bump that honestly felt like I'd hit a body or something like it, but I just kept going. My car was driving terribly, but I just kept driving until I was past the fence, out of the rich neighborhood until I stopped at a gas station. And when I got there, I noticed that my right tire was really messed up, and in the end, I actually needed to change it, because there were a few nails that looked like they had been attached to a piece of wood on my tire. I was freaked out by that pretty hard, and sometimes I wish that I could have called the cops and reported it, but of course, all that happened was I got a flat on a back road, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my night waiting in a cop car for basically nothing. Now, I know it's far more likely that I just freaked myself out, and that a bunch of Nazis were probably just planning to mess with a random Uber driver. But when I pick up a well-dressed businesswoman from a remote location and drop her off at a separate remote location, and my tires end up flat in the end, it just gives me chills that I still have trouble explaining to this day. This happened a couple of years ago when we used to live in a house in the mountains. The only neighbor that we had wasn't that close from our home, so there's literally no one around. This happened on a Sunday. I had my daughter, she was 13, coming for the weekend and she was sleeping upstairs. My bedroom is downstairs. I was in the living room just watching TV when I decided to go outside to contemplate the stars. And the thing is that I had to leave my door semi-open because there's only one handle, logically, inside the house, and the other side of the door can only be opened with a key, so no handle from the outside. I contemplated the stars for about 5 minutes, but then I felt like I could smell a really weird smell. I went back inside. It was 3 a.m., so I decided to just go back to sleep. When I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, I could see the sunrise, so I decided to open up my window, since it was extremely hot inside, and stood up at the edge of the window, when suddenly I felt like a hand was pushing me in my back, and then I was pushed out of my window by somebody. But the thing is that there was only me and my daughter in my house, and I got pushed out of my house by a stranger, and my daughter was still inside. Since the window was closed, I couldn't open the front door either. Because I didn't have the keys, I knew that my neighbour was a locksmith, so I subsequently rushed to his house, woke him up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and explained the situation to him as best as I could. He quickly took his stuff and came with me to my house, and I'll now tell you what my daughter told me. She told me later that she could hear an old man coughing and that she didn't recognize the cough. So she instantly went into the bathroom, locked the door of the bathroom. The door of her bedroom didn't have a lock, only the bathroom had, and she turned on the tap while she was calling the police. My neighbour eventually managed to open the door too, and we rushed upstairs. And whilst going upstairs too, I noticed that a knife was missing from my knife set in the kitchen. We went upstairs and we saw that the door of my daughter's room was opened. We quickly turned on the lights and we saw an old man with a hood holding one of the knives just waiting in front of the bathroom door. Well, my neighbour and I, we beat the absolute living daylights out of this guy, and then we waited until the police came. The man got arrested, and I'm happy to say that a week after that, we moved into another county. So this happened when I was much younger. I want to say freshman in high school, probably like 2008 or something. There used to be this road near where I live, though, in CA, called Croak Road. It was barely a road. No one travelled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forest and some abandoned barns and houses and whatnot. I would typically go there with my friends to skateboard and hang out. This one night, though, I was hanging out with two of my friends, Lucas and Dorian, and someone wanted to go to Croak Road to hang out since it was creepy at night. It might sound lame, but we sort of loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders and weren't really into smoking or anything, so what else were you to do, right? I asked my 20-year-old brother James if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. Soon, one particular path that we were travelling down had become so narrow, James's Ford Explorer couldn't pass through it, so we got out and walked for a while, chatting and just having fun. We walked through the woods for about half an hour, I'd say, until it had gotten relatively dark out and the sun was gone, at which point we sort of just turned around to head back to the car. It's now that I should mention too that despite being near a lot of subdevelopments, this patch of forest was huge. I'd say about 1,000 acres at least, and rarely visited since it was easy to get lost in, especially at night. I mean, it was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James managed it and we were off down the road again. Dorian proposed that we turn down a different path that we had passed by earlier since we had another 40 minutes until our parents wanted us back, and so we agreed. Down this path was a tiny pond that Dorian wanted to check out to take pictures of since he had gotten the opportunity to visit it at night. It was pretty slow going since this road was even worse than the main one that we were travelling on that turned off to Croak Road. But minutes later, we got into a slight argument. Dorian was convinced that James had taken a wrong turn since we should have arrived at the pond by now, while James claimed that he had been driving straight the whole time. It was dark after all, but eventually we came to a fork in the road and none of us were familiar with it. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up just guessing and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything, I would say. In fact, we were actually kind of excited and intrigued. I mean, we were driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night on some sort of an adventure. But it was at this point that we rounded a small bend in the road and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. Because there were 4 figures emerging from the forest and crossing the road, wearing what looked like long cloaks with the hoods up and holding flashlights. And one guy at the back of the group was dragging a large duffel bag, a human-sized duffel bag, mind you. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation, and as soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they froze as well. James instantly pulled to the left and went around them. Driving past them felt like an eternity because, well, we couldn't have been going over 5 miles per hour due to the terrible condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them inches beyond my window, and they were indeed wearing black robes and holding flashlights. I actually didn't get a good look at the bag, but judging by the way the guy was holding it, something heavy was definitely inside of it. None of us said a word until the road straightened out and we were far past these guys, at which point James muttered, "What the heck was that?" We continued down the road in silence until I heard Lucas say, "What's that?" and repeat himself in a louder, panicked voice. He said, "They're coming back." I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing at the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away, we saw the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. The guys were without a doubt running after us. All of us screamed at James to floor it, and he sped down the road as quickly as he could. The car was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we flew over berms and potholes and everything. I kept my eyes on the flashlight beams until we rounded another bend in the road and they were out of sight. And thankfully, the road did manage to take us back to the main pathway. James then gunned it down the road until we popped off by Croak Road and we just got the heck out of there. But the weirdest thing about all of this is that there couldn't have been a vehicle anywhere near those guys for at least 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen one if there had been, but we explored most of the area before and there just wasn't anywhere to pull off the road and park and whatnot. We didn't really say anything more until we were back at my place. We talked about it for a bit, and then my friends went home and James and I went to bed. I didn't know if we should be calling the cops or not, but James, who I would guess would be the adult in the situation, seemed reluctant, so in the end I just dropped it. I never did tell my parents too until just before writing this, and they kind of scolded me for not telling them, and that we should have contacted the authorities, apparently, just to report suspicious people in the preserve. Truthfully, I don't know if that would have made much of a difference, but I still do wish to know just how the heck they got there, where they were going, and also what the heck was in that bag. I was born and raised in South Carolina. It was always tough living there because I'm an African American lady. My family and I grew up in a middle, upper class neighborhood. Both my parents are immigrants who worked hard to give my siblings and I a pretty good life. But it was a Saturday evening when my parents went out on a date. I was 14 at the time and they trusted that I would be able to babysit my little brother and sister. I'd done this, must have been 1,000,000 times by this point, so I wasn't worried. They left the house at around 8 and promised to be back no later than 11 p.m. Everything seemed perfectly fine at first too. My brother was in the first living room just playing on his Xbox, I was on the couch near him using my phone, and my sister was upstairs in our room just messing around with her tablet. Now, the layout of the house was something like this. Apologies in advance if this doesn't make sense too, but you open the front door and immediately to your right you have the first living room. That leads into a dining room, which leads into the kitchen. The kitchen is open and leads into the second living room, and from there you can access the backyard and a door to the garage. On the left of the front door you can go up the stairs to the bedrooms. On one side of the hall you have my sister and I's room, and a bathroom on the other. You have the master bedroom and my brother's room there too. So I'm sitting on the couch with my brother. I then hear the garage door being opened. It was only around 9 p.m. though, and I knew my parents would never come back home this early. So I got up to meet them at the door and see why, assuming that something came up. Whenever they leave, I always make sure the door from the garage is locked though, so I usually have to let them in. I walk up to the door and just as I was about to open it, I stopped. I don't know why, but I felt kind of anxious for whatever reason and didn't really want to open up the door until I heard that it was them. It was then that I saw the doorknob wiggle violently and I got scared and took a step back. I called out, "Mum?" No response. Dad? Is that you? Stop messing around. Nothing. I started to get pretty scared at this point. Dad, if that's you, then please say something. You're scaring me. After I said this, the wiggle got way more violent. It looked like the door was going to burst any moment. By this point, my brother stopped playing his game and ran into the kitchen. Fearing for our lives too, I ran into the kitchen, grabbed one of the biggest knives that we had, took my brother's hand and ran upstairs. There, I grabbed my sister and ran into my brother's room. By now, I had actually heard the door burst open. I locked the door and hid my siblings in the closet while I pushed the dresser in front of it to sort of barricade it. After I did that, I sat on his bed and I called the cops. The operator got all of my details and said the cops would be there in about 5 minutes. And as I sat on that bed, I'll never forget just how absolutely terrified I felt. My mind was completely blank until I heard running up the stairs. The light sobbing in the closet from my siblings turned into fearful screams, and I had my back against the wall shaking as I held the knife in front of me. And eventually they get to the end of the hall where my brother's room is and they try to open the door. They get really angry and start banging and yelling at us to open it up. I could tell by the voice too that it was definitely a man. Eventually, he's able to bust the lock and slide the door open. We lock eyes as he tries to get past my little makeshift barricade. I get a good look at his face and features. He couldn't have been more than 5'10" and had a stocky build and a really deep voice. He had, at least to me, very obviously gotten cosmetic surgery too. His face looked incredibly artificial. His skin had this unnatural smoothness to it. He had these grossly big lips and his eyes seemed to be just a little too big almost. I was on the verge of tears when I just yelled, "Don't come any closer, the police are on their way." And that seemed to stop him in his tracks. He took one last look at me when he ran down the stairs and out the front door. I immediately ran to the closet to check on my siblings and to see if they were okay. They were pretty scared, but other than that, they were all right, thankfully. I heard the police finally pull up to my house about a minute later. An officer came in and yelled to see if we were okay. I remember being taken to the station with my siblings and calling my parents along the way. We did file a report, but unfortunately nothing ever came of it. I remember being so angry about it too. I mean, there just couldn't be that many people who looked like this guy. How was it so hard to find someone who left the crime scene within minutes before them arriving? I don't know, but I'm just glad that none of us were hurt that day. So this was way back in 2014. I was a 20-year-old community college student living with my parents in Southern California. I had a tight-knit group of stoner friends. There were 5 of us, myself included. And we're all still best friends today, even. Like all suburban kids, our days hanging out usually consisted of just loitering in parking lots, getting stoned, and going to parties when we could. We had a few smoke pots around town that we would go to and get high at. Our main spot was a place that we called the sewer lair. It was a giant storm tunnel at the end of a trail in this canyon area behind one of the local neighborhoods. It was secluded, and we could be as loud as we wanted to since there were no houses nearby. The tunnel was maybe 20 feet in diameter, I would guess. A small stream of water ran down the center of it, though. There was this offshoot directly to the right, just past the entrance, that led to another smaller tunnel system too. And this is where we would hang out. We would come here almost every night, in fact. So one night, we were at the sewer lair. It was maybe around 1 o'clock in the morning, and we would usually hang out pretty late and wait for our parents to go to sleep, so we don't come home and have to see them smelling like weed and cigarettes and whatnot. Me and the boys were smoking, talking, and listening to music. The usual. Except this night, water was draining from one of the tunnel systems further down. It was pretty loud. It sounded like a small waterfall almost. This happened a few times before, so we didn't think anything of it. We don't get much rain in California, so it made sense that this would only happen once in a while. But a few hours in, one of the guys kept looking over at the main tunnel and says that He thinks that he's hearing voices. We tell him that it's just the music and our voices echoing, but we turn off the music and listen silently to prove that he's just stoned and being paranoid. We listen closely and we could actually hear these faint voices too. It was difficult to hear because of the waterfall, but it sounded like a group of people chanting maybe? We froze though and we traded glances. We sat in silence and listened for a few minutes. One of the bros finally snapped and insisted that we go check it out. A few of the bros were scared though and didn't want to do it, but after some bickering we decided to go and see what was happening. There were 5 of us. What could go wrong? So we used the flashlights on our phones and we make our way down the tunnel. We must have walked for about 15 minutes and the chanting got louder, but it still sounded very far away. We still couldn't make out what they were saying because the waterfall was so loud, but it was definitely a group of people speaking in unison. We walked for a while longer, and at this point, we made it so far that there wasn't even graffiti on the walls or trash on the ground anymore. As we continued walking, we noticed that the tunnel was getting warmer. But it was always really cold in here, so it was strange that the temperature was gradually rising the further we went in. We kept moving though. The chanting was getting so loud that we knew that we were close. It was loud enough to realize that the chanting was in a different language and that it had to be at least 4 or 5 people as well. We kept moving and noticed the graffiti on the wall started to show up again. And this time it was very different than before. It was all very eerie. I immediately brushed it off as just edgy kids trying to scare people, but the further we walked, the more unsettling the markings on the walls became. It was a lot of weird sort of occult type stuff, and then we noticed that there were melted black candles scattered on the ground with these weird trinkets around them. The trinkets looked handmade and were made of animal bones, string and cloth by the looks of things. We were all quietly inspecting the area when one of the guys points down the tunnel and tells us to cut the lights. We quickly turn off the flashlights and we look, and we could see a faint flickering orange light far down the tunnel. It was just barely visible because it was so far, but we could tell that the light was coming from either candles or torches by the way that it was flickering. It wasn't a direct light either, so it had to be coming from one of the offshoots in the tunnel. Our phones were all getting low on battery now, so we started speed walking toward the orange light. The chanting continued. But then, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream bellowed from the tunnel up ahead. We all froze and we put our lights down immediately. It was the most terrifying scream that I've ever heard in my life to date. I couldn't even tell if it was human or an animal. But the chanting continued, and then another horrifying scream echoed down the tunnel. The guys were ready to get the heck out of there, but I insisted that we should definitely check this out. I mean, what if somebody's in trouble? I led the way as we slowly walked toward the light. The chanting and the screaming continued. We made it about 30 feet from the offshoot that the light and the voices were coming from. The tunnel was really hot at this point too, and it just smelled absolutely awful. The air was really thick and it was difficult to breathe now as well. We were sweating and it felt like we were suffocating. But we inched our way toward the offshoot as the chanting continued, flinching every time there was another awful scream. The screams had become increasingly more violent and non-human sounding, but we were all lined up with our backs against the wall of the main tunnel in front of the offshoot. The chanting and the screams were coming from right around the corner now, and the boys gestured at me to take a peek. I took a big, deep breath. My heart was absolutely pounding, and then I quickly peeked in for a second and then pulled back. Now, this offshoot was exactly like the one at the entrance that we would hang out at, and what I saw at the center was a naked man on his knees with his hands on the ground and his back to me. He was covered in dirt and sweat, and he was in front of what looked like some kind of a handcrafted altar. The walls were covered in writing. The whole area had crowds of black candles lining the walls, and they were all lit. There had to be at least 50 or 60 of them, I would guess. The man was also sitting at the center of some kind of a candle formation, and upon seeing this, my face just went numb. I looked at the guys, and I couldn't even speak. The chanting and the screams continued, though, as I just gave them a blank stare. I couldn't even comprehend what was happening. The chanting and the screaming sounded like it had to be a total of at least 5 people, but I could only see one guy in there. I decided to take another peek, sort of mid-hand gestures and whatnot, and this time my whole body went numb. All of the chanting and the screaming was coming from this one guy. It was like he had 5 voices at once or something. I immediately gestured to one of the guys next to me to take a look. He stepped forward and his foot accidentally brushed against the ground, making a loud scraping sound that echoed all throughout the tunnel. We all froze immediately. And then the chanting completely stopped. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was dead silent. We all looked at each other, and then, out of nowhere, we just made a sprint for the entrance all at once. None of us even said a word. We just ran and ran as fast as we could, and it felt like we were running forever because we had gone so far in. We must have hauled butt for about 10 minutes too before finally getting out of the storm tunnel. When we got out of the tunnel and we felt the fresh air on our face finally, we just stood in the field in front of the sewer there and we caught our breath. A couple of the bigger guys were throwing up from the sprinting. After we caught our breath, though, I told them everything that I saw. They were all speechless, trying to comprehend what just happened. But then we started hearing screams from the tunnel again. This time, they were long and drawn out, almost like a howling wolf. We didn't stick around, though. We ran up the trail to the neighborhood and we just got the heck out of there. And we also vowed to never come back here again. This all happened about 6 years ago now, and it still haunts me and the bros, even to today. I have no explanation for what happened that day. I don't know much about Satanism or occult type stuff, but if anyone does, then please feel free to give your thoughts on what you think was happening that night. I suppose that it's possible that there were more people somewhere chanting and that maybe it wasn't just one guy, but when I looked around that corner, I didn't see anybody else. I don't know, but I would really appreciate your input, and thanks for listening. This took place in San Francisco in the early 90s. I was a 33-year-old female living alone in San Francisco. I had a good job though, and I was very interested in real estate. I decided to walk to a neighborhood grocery store to pick up a real estate magazine. Well, that's just what you did back then. We didn't really have the internet yet. But I remember that it was a rare, warm evening in San Francisco, and there were quite a few people walking around outside. I was walking behind a group of about 5 or 6 apparently unrelated people. At least, they weren't talking to each other, so that's what I assumed. I'm rather short, so all I could really see were their backs, when suddenly, without a single word from any of them, they all turned around and started walking back in the direction that we had just come from. I was a bit amazed by this, and sort of turned around to look at them, sort of shrugged it off too, and just kept going in my original direction. But as I turned my head, I was stunned to see a man just in front of me pointing a gun at me, grinning like a madman. He was about my height, wearing those green mechanic overalls, covered head to toe in grease and dirt. Startled, I was about 2 feet from him, and my gut reaction was just to continue going forward. And so, I passed him, every muscle in my body tense, heart racing, and just kept walking. But to my dismay, I heard his footsteps following me now. Then he started whispering things like, "Oh, you're a bad one, huh? Why don't you run? Run." At that moment, my mind seized on the belief that he was waiting for me to run before he shot me in the back. And he seemed to want it just so badly, so I was determined to do the opposite now. I kept walking instead, expecting to feel a bullet slam into my spine at any moment. But that shot, it never came, and I believe then and now too that if I had run, that would have given him the piece of his fantasy that he needed. I headed up a hill and around a corner to a gas station with people in it. It was dark by the time that I got there, but when I turned around, he was gone. Several years ago, I worked at a voluntary crisis unit for the acutely mentally ill. It was a 10-bed unit where individuals would come to stay as a sort of step down from a psychiatric hospitalization or a diversion to prevent psychiatric hospitalization in the first place. I often worked alone on the weekends. And then one Friday evening, we received an admission that Michael. Background info was provided with the referral indicating a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and recently released from prison after serving a sentence for murder. I'd completed the initial intake meeting with Michael, during which time he said some really sexually explicit things to me. I made it clear that this was inappropriate and that confidentiality was limited in that the staff working on the unit, as a part of his treatment team, would be privy to anything said in the interview or subsequent one-on-one sessions. He responded well to the redirection and we finished the intake, and I went about the rest of my shift until about 11 p.m. that night when he approached the office and asked if I was working alone. Luckily at the time I wasn't alone, and I told him that my male co-worker was in the adjoining office. After this encounter, I explained the situation to my co-worker, who read my shift summary and decided to sit down with Michael and tell him the way that he was acting was not acceptable and he could risk being released from the program if it continued. The next morning I was working alone from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Around 9 a.m. I went to wake up another client, Jeremy, to administer his medications. The room Jeremy was assigned to was at the end of the hallway, and he was usually slow to get up in the mornings. While I was knocking on Jeremy's door, Michael approached me to tell me that he didn't appreciate that I had shared the things that he said to me with my male co-worker. I explained to Michael that he knew what he said was inappropriate and that he knew anything that he said to me would be shared with the rest of the treatment team. Michael then became way more agitated and got in my face all of a sudden, backing me into the corner in front of Jeremy's bedroom door. At this point, Jeremy had woken up and heard what was happening outside of his room. Jeremy came out of his room, stood between Michael and myself, and told Michael that he needed to walk away and cool down. Michael went back to his room, and I contacted my supervisor, who told me to document the encounter and to continue my shift. Needless to say, I left that job shortly after this incident, though. I am thankful for Jeremy and that he had the presence of mind, while also being a client with a mental illness, to intervene on my behalf. I often wonder what would have happened if Jeremy wouldn't have woken up that day, or if he would have been in a more severe state of mental illness and would have become agitated as well. I try not to think too much about what happened that day, though, because, well, like I said, Michael, he was a convicted murderer. When I was young, I'm talking like 3 or 4 years old, I moved to a newly built house in Baytown, Texas. And there wasn't anything creepy or weird about it until about a few months later. I vividly remember this too because I had a chalkboard in my room and it was centered right in the middle of my room. One night I was laying in bed and I kept glancing over at the eraser on the chalkboard, and it was sitting straight up, so I walked over and set it down and got back into bed. Well, when I looked back again, it was standing straight up, so I went to place it back down and it happened again. I cried for my mum at this point. I can't remember if I told her or not what happened. The next thing that I remember is waking up downstairs. I don't sleepwalk. I've never slept walk in my life, but I woke up downstairs and, of course, I was really confused. I ran back upstairs and I keep hearing someone running behind me up the stairs. I wasn't dreaming, I was definitely awake. But some years later, in my teenage years, I told my mum about this and she told me that I was talking to someone. Apparently, I was holding someone's hand and talking to someone downstairs. I don't remember that, but the next thing is something that I will probably never be able to explain. I did tell my mum about this one, and she didn't believe me, even though she does believe in spirits. But it was raining outside, a really bad thunderstorm that day, and I was afraid of thunder. I love it now as an adult, but as a kid it was scary to me. I ducked my head under the covers, and I remember getting slapped. And the slap really hurt. It even made a sound, but I think that I was so scared that I must have passed out. I can never explain that, but there was no one in my room. I would have heard the door open, and my parents wouldn't slap me over me being scared. The other things are minor, but in this house I would have the most vividest dreams. There was one dream in particular that I remember, and I woke up in the house and went to my dad's office to find like 3 or maybe 2, can't remember, gravestones in his office. They didn't have names, but shortly after I woke up. The other dream that I had was that I was in my room, but I was talking to this massive black shadow with a deep voice, and it yelled at me, and I woke up in a sweat. The last thing I can remember from that time there too is that I used to have this pencil-looking sort of bag holder. Again, I was young, and I swore that this thing used to move. I was always so scared of it too that we put it outside, and I remember hearing scraping on the carpet outside of my room, and I would go outside and check, and I could see marks on the carpet like it was moving. Oh, and I also remember that my closet door used to open by itself too. It was a slide closet door that opened by itself a few times, and yeah, that one used to freak me out too. When I was young, maybe 5, I told my grandma about some of the stuff that happened, and she took me to see a priest and get blessed and whatnot. I'm unsure if they actually worked, because on and off I've been experiencing weird things, even when we moved out of that house into a different house, but a lot of it did stop, I must admit. Anyway, it honestly feels good telling someone about this because, well, no one's really ever believed me. Maybe one day I can tell my parents about more of this, or my mother at least. My dad would just never believe me, but I don't know. For now, it feels good to get it off my chest. When I was a teenager, my older brother moved out, and my parents both worked late. So, occasionally, I would spend evenings by myself after school. We lived in the countryside, a few miles outside of town, and had a good collection of neighbours. The day just went as normally as ever as well. I went to school, got home, turned on the TV, had a snack, and texted one of my friends who I had a crush on. It wasn't long afterward that I noticed a man outside of my house, and he walked past a few times. He wasn't an ordinary person walking around the block too. He looked scraggly and sort of unkempt. I ducked as far as I could behind a chair, still trying to see him out of the living room windows, hoping that he didn't see me. But soon, he came to the front door and he knocked. I was texting my friend the entire time, increasingly getting freaked out, obviously. As he knocked on the door, I stupidly went to answer it as well. I had my phone with me with 911 at the ready. I tried to sort of silently unlock the door to not alert the man, and then I opened the door a crack. There was a screen door separating myself and the man. I was ready to slam the door and lock it if anything happened, but the man just sort of looked at me with crazed and paranoid eyes. He had a large dark beard and looked to be maybe in his late 50s or early 60s if I had to guess. He seemed out of breath and his face was just drenched with sweat. He was larger too, more the reason to keep my guard, right? But I sheepishly said hello. "Please, call the police, they're after me," he said in an exhausted smoker voice. He kept looking at the road and tensed whenever a car would occasionally pass. Who's after you?" I asked, getting ready to slam the door. "Listen, I barely escaped. They were right behind me, please. Can I come inside?" And at this, I knew to call the police. "Just wait here, okay? I'll get someone to help." My heart was completely in my throat at this point. I didn't know if this guy was going to try and force his way into the door, so I quickly shut it and I locked it. I ran to check the back door as well, and locked that as well as I called 911. My heart was racing and I could barely tell the operator my information, but they said that they would send somebody out. It wasn't long too until a patrol car arrived, but it felt like forever, I can tell you. The entire time I kept watching the man who then walked into my driveway, pacing nervously. The officer got out and proceeded to talk with this guy, and they got in the car and they left. I still have no idea what happened to this guy too, nor if he was even telling the truth. He could have been drunk or crazy, but it was genuine fear in his eyes, I think, when I looked at him. Something truly scared this guy, and it scared me to think that there could be someone out there that wanted people for whatever reason, as much as he seemed to be letting on. Anyway, like I said, I really don't know what happened to the guy, but I do wish him all the best. So for the record, I'm actually a female. I'm turning 19 this year, and this story happened when I was 15. Also, I'm actually from France. So when I was 15 years old and just got into junior year, I created my first Twitter account that I deleted because of this story. Some information before I get started. I didn't tell anyone my username, neither my family or my friends. My profile picture was an avatar, so no pictures of me on the account. And as for the location, I said Paris because I lived in the suburbs. I didn't have many followers too, 20 or maybe 30 if I was lucky, and I didn't follow that many people. And as such, my TL just wasn't really interesting. Now, one evening, in October, someone sent me quite a strange direct message. It was a 200 followers account, and the message was something like, "Hi, my name is Rob. I just turned 17 and wanted to know if you lived in such and such a place because I will soon move in and go to the town in the high school, and I'm looking for friends." And that place was obviously the town that I lived in. I immediately thought that something was wrong because there was nowhere on my profile that I said where I actually lived, but after some time of thinking, I remembered a tweet that I made weeks ago about buses, and I mentioned the city, so I told myself that he must have looked up for that street or whatever that I was in and found my tweet. His age wasn't that shocking to me because I'm 2 years ahead of my classmates anyway. And quite frankly, I was just bored and he seemed polite, so I answered him. I told him that I lived in the city and I go to the high school there. The discussion was pretty natural and we talked a lot that night, mainly about high school, about the food at the cafeteria, about the teachers, that kind of thing, but as it was getting very late, he tried to interpose some personal questions, like, do you live far away from the school, in a house or in an apartment? Do you live with both of your parents? There's 5 of you? You're not often home alone, right? I never really answered because it was way too shady for me, and unfortunately, he didn't insist. And I say unfortunately because if he did, I probably would have blocked him and that would have been the end of it. But the next day, the same thing. We talked a lot and he was still asking really personal questions to know me better, so I asked some too. And he always seemed like he answered honestly. I still didn't answer the questions about my house though, because he didn't need to know anything about that. This lasted for about 2 or 3 weeks, but it was enough for me to develop feelings for him. He was handsome, super kind, and it was everything that I needed at that point, because I was bullied for years, and even today I still develop strong feelings, but most importantly blind trust in people who are friendly to me has gone out the window for the most part. Now, in France in October, we have a 2-week-long vacation, and the day before back to school day, he finally told me that he was coming to my high school, because he finally moved in with his mum, and he asked me a place to meet during the morning break. I'll admit too that I was really happy and sort of relieved to be able to finally meet him, and told him to join me in the hall. But when he understood that there would be people around, he said that he would prefer an isolated place because he was afraid that he would not recognize me and didn't want to spend the break looking for me. It was a good enough excuse for me. I know, kind of stupid, but I told him to meet me in the third floor bathroom because we weren't allowed to stay there during the breaks and no one would disturb us. In my head, even though it was a little bit creepy, I'll admit, I still was in school, so nothing could happen to me, right? Next day, back to school day, I made myself pretty, I wore my best clothes, I counted down the minutes, and finally, when break time arrived, I ran to the bathroom and waited. And when he arrived, it was him. He wasn't a catfish. He looked quite like his profile picture, but I still noticed that he seemed a little bit older than he told me. I thought maybe 20 years old instead of 17. We talked a lot though, we got along really well, I was really pleased, and at the end of the break, he asked me to go to the fast food place with him for lunch. I said no in the end because I didn't have any money, and I always refuse people to pay for me and whatnot. It's a principle thing. He seemed disappointed, but offered to walk me home after class. I explained to him that I have to take the bus, but that he could walk me to the bus stop if he liked to. He looked disappointed at this, again, but finally he seemed to accept it. And that's exactly what happened. And it was so great that it quickly became some kind of a routine. We met in the third floor bathroom during the morning break, and he always walked me to the bus stop after classes. Surprising fact, too, is that I never saw him in the hallways nor at the cafeteria, but I thought that at that time the building was huge and there were like at least 1,500 students in there, so if our schedules didn't coincide perfectly, there was pretty much no way that we would meet each other. This little game lasted until December, so almost a month and a half. The 14th of December, a Thursday, I complained about how lonely I was going to be that evening because my dad was abroad for work, my brother was always at his friend's house, my little sister was on a school trip, and my mum had work late that very night. It was very reckless of me, I know, but after weeks, I honestly thought that I could trust him. That evening, he walked me to the bus stop like normal. We both waited, and I got on the bus, waved at him, and put on my earphones. I had 2 stops before my house. It was about 17:45 in December, so it was already really dark outside, and as I got off the bus, I just, for some reason, had a really bad feeling. There was that really uncomfortable sensation in my stomach, and I felt like I was being watched. I paused my music, but kept my earphones in, so that people thought that I couldn't hear anything, and honestly, that is exactly what probably saved my life that day. I lived in a suburban neighborhood, like I said, very silent, especially at night, with no visibility on the big road the bus passed in. When I heard footsteps behind me, I understood right away that there was somebody following me, and he was not well-intentioned. At this point, at least, I could hear that he wasn't accelerating, so he wasn't trying to catch up with me, but I couldn't guess how long it would have lasted. As quietly as possible, I tried to reach for my keys in my pocket, and when I finally pulled them out, I ran as fast as I could. The best sprint of my life, in fact. I don't know how it worked, but I managed to open and close the door before he could reach me. I then deactivated my alarm, which, by the way, confirmed that I was home alone, and quickly took a good look through the glass panel on the door. It wasn't a peephole, it was like a whole window thing, so if someone wanted to see what was happening inside, they actually could. And you guessed it, it was him, a few meters away, looking at me with a really creepy look on his face. He followed me to my home, probably with a car, and he was clearly not here for a chit-chat. I still don't know why I didn't call the police. I was just totally paralyzed, and honestly, I wasn't quite sure what to think at that point. But we both stared at each other for a minute. When I took back control over my body, I ran into the kitchen to get a knife and got back to the door. And he was still there too, banging against the door now. I feared for a second that the glass would break, but thankfully it didn't happen. And that moment when I was pushing against the door, praying for it not to break while he was kicking it harder and harder, was the longest moments that I've ever experienced. After maybe 5 minutes, he just eventually stopped and got around the house, knocking against every shutter, and got back to the door. He looked really angry, but then my neighbor's car reached my house and he ran away, probably thinking that it was my mum coming home. On Twitter, he sent me 1,000 messages before I could block him. He then deleted his account, and I thought that I was done with the story. But quickly after this, some accounts which had recently been created followed me. Their ats were all a series of numbers and the first letter of his name. And as soon as I blocked one, another one would follow me. I chose to delete my account at that point because I just couldn't make it stop, and it was just too hard to endure because they were sending me dozens of insulting DMs every single day. Luckily, I talked to other people who were supposed to be this person's classmates because I hadn't seen him again in days. But not a single one had ever heard of this guy. And I'm pretty sure that this person was never even a student of this high school. And that explains why I never met him apart from our daily meetings. And that's also probably why he just seemed so old. I never did hear from him again, which I'm thankful for, and I'm still asking myself, though, what exactly did he want? And what would have happened to me that night if I hadn't have had that funny feeling? So about 5 years ago, I, male and 26, set out to travel the world. Being straight out of college, it had left me in a fair bit of debt, and so I was ever more desperate for any job that I was overqualified for, and generally depressed too. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington, and found the only way to get out was to travel. My high school buddy suggested that I look into woofing and volunteering as a way to travel cheap, and so I did just that. The way it works is quite simple too. Basically, you work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community is a bunch of cheap-ass travelers, it's quite big. It's a great way to meet new people, get outside of your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. So fast forward 8 months, and I am now a seasoned cow turd shoveler. I started out in Washington, Oregon, and went south to California. There, I was able to save some money. I was paid under the table for some extra work and was now faced with a decision of where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me too. And on the advice of some stupid hippie volunteering partner, I chose it at random. I went to a randomizer website and I clicked the country button, Georgia, the country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it, too, was an understatement. But the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow. And so, I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were a few options in the end, and most were pretty remote and didn't even have internet connection. I messaged every single one, too, because few ever responded, and got a response from one farm on top of a mountain. The picture showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out in the back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, animals, and it seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English too, and the requirements for work seemed pretty reasonable. I was excited. After I flew to the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are pretty messed up since few have been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor too. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis and weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up to a steep hill, into a national park up to the north of the country. And there was nothing for miles on end but trees and their dead silence. As I got up that hill, I saw the house about a half a mile away on an even steeper hill surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint, it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and sort of dreary. As I walked past the gate, Geary, the apparent owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and, in broken English, started to show me around. He also just stank of booze. But as he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent of, "They're away right now." By this point, I'm pretty creeped out. From browsing around, it was very apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying, the roof of the small barn was caved in, the house itself was full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Geary was going through a very rough patch. But I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere without a plan, especially having not slept for the past 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying as best as he could to hold a conversation in English, Geary showed me my room on the second floor, and eventually I fell asleep. In fact, I almost immediately blacked out from the exhaustion and stress, and actually probably would have slept 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sort of sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and eventually I just went back to sleep once it stopped. In the morning, Geary, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and the doors in the house, as he himself planned to go and fetch some components in a nearby village or something. But again, I just got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something just wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was really evasive. There was no cell reception here, no internet. And once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent that the place was hardly ever lived in. Like one of those abandoned houses. There was broken furniture, newspapers, and old photos on the floor, a shattered mirror. I took my phone and looked through the saved listings again, and that was when I noticed that the photos didn't really match either the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Geary wasn't in any of them, in fact, which meant that I was in a completely different house. By this point, I'm in full-blown panic. I pack my stuff up and start to leave when I see a group of 3 men going up that first hill. There aren't any paths that I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time, I stop and listen. I hear them in the house. They're clearly looking for me, and afraid of making any noise, I just remain still, hidden behind a bush. I don't know how long I must have waited there for, but man, were they persistent. At some point, I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path, and once I find it's all clear, I just book it the heck out of there. Never ran this fast, in fact, but I'm still in the middle of nowhere. No traffic, no public transport, nothing. Eventually, I reached a paved road and I start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by, but finally, a car drives by and stops. Now, in a horror movie, this would have been Geary and his friends, right? But this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. But when I finally got internet access again, the listing had disappeared from the website, and a few days before I left, and I haven't heard from Geary ever since. I'm yet to make sense of that experience. I have travelled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say that the guy was coming over with a couple of friends from the village to have a chat over a few beers or something. But some, they say that he was bound to kidnap me and even kill me. But I trust my gut feeling. Something just was really not right about that place, and I'm glad that I ran when I did. A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to a forest nearby our house, and we were in Poland for the holidays, as we do every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So one day, we decided to take out Mum's old tent that she still had from like the 90s and just stay for the night, or two in between some wildlife. Good thing too is that the place that we chose to sleep at was only about 20 or maybe 30 minutes away from the house. The bad thing though was that there are a lot, and I mean a lot of wolves, foxes, and boars out in this forest, and honestly, I kind of regretted going there in the first place. But we set everything up at around 6 p.m, and my sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe. That's an important part of the story for later too. And by now, it had dried out enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours or so, until it was so dark that we decided to just head in to sleep. My two sisters and I were on one end of the tent and my parents on the other. Now, it was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves or homesickness maybe, I don't know, but for some reason I really just couldn't sleep that night at all. I heard my dad tell my mum that he was going out into the forest to get some wood for the morning while it was still fairly dry, or it would be all soaked up with the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to even close my eyes for a second. I'm really not too good at telling what time it was too by just staring at the sky while trying to figure out how long I'd been there, so I would say maybe around 12 or 1 in the morning, but who really knows. I was actually just about to fall asleep too when I heard some rattling outside of the tent. My first thought was, oh no, it's a wolf. I was honestly terrified, and so I just sort of popped my head through the little curtain that separated the two halves of the tent, basically just a piece of thin fabric hanging on some threads, to see if my dad was back. But he was still gone, and it had been over an hour since he went. I was confident of that. I lay back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side, I saw this faint human shadow outside of the tent. I froze and let out a ton of teeny squeak. The person seemed to be holding some sort of an axe or maybe shovel type thing or something in its hand, and so I thought at first, maybe that's my dad and he's back now. The shadow walked towards the entrance of the tent and just stood there at the zipped up door for maybe 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside, but the person finally ran off into the forest and dropped an axe. You could hear the footsteps fade in the distance and a thump just appear along the way. And quite honestly, at first I thought, what the heck is my dad doing? Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and enter the tent all tired, and then he just fell asleep. Seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late that I couldn't even think anymore, and somehow I fell asleep eventually. The next morning, I woke up after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him, and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air, though, because I was feeling a bit sick. Maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness, I couldn't really tell. But both of us get out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for around 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. And that's when I noticed something that made chills run down the back of my neck. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize that I actually saw something, and when I turned my head to see what it was a red and black rubber axe. I can tell you right now that it definitely was not there before. I knew that it wasn't my dad's because his was by the pile of wood that he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because, well, even he started to freak out a little bit, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared for a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour, and then we just rushed back up. Later, I told my dad what I saw that night, and he didn't believe me at first. But I carried on with the story, and he finally realized that I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the heck that was, but man, am I happy that he didn't investigate our tent any further, or any other animal had in that forest. A little bit of backstory. When my parents dug the foundation of the house that I grew up in, they actually came upon a native burial ground. Upon finding this, they reburied the remains and called a native priest to come and bless the land. They ended up moving the foundation over about 50 feet to build their house in the end too. Fast forward to when I was a child and a teenager, I would always hear my name being called from what sounded like family members, but nobody was home. There were a multitude of years that this went on as well, and I would seek help and understanding for what was going on. Nothing ever came of my search for answers. It was always just put off as an imagination. But here is where things started to get weird. So, I remember one night in particular. It still gives me extreme emotions thinking about it today, 12 plus years later. But I was sitting in the basement playing Call of Duty 4, home alone, as was the par with all of my paranormal experiences. And all of a sudden, crisp as day, I hear a little girl singing a song in what sounds like an ancient language. Nothing I've ever heard before, or ever again. But I sit there frozen just listening to her, until this great amount of fear just takes over my body. I bolt up from my chair and go to walk to the stairs, and that was when it happened. It was honestly like I just walked into a deep freezer. I'm completely frozen at this point too, and I'm sure you can smell the terror on me. I was stuck there in this spot for what seemed like forever when it just suddenly went away. Later that night, I had a dream about a little girl in a white dress who was singing a song. The same girl that apparently I'd heard while playing games in my basement. This memory was stuck with me too, clear as day for the better part of the 12 years that I mentioned, always in the back of my mind. When I told people at the time what had happened, it was always just brushed off as mental illness of some sort, but I know that this just wasn't the case. Years later, I come to find out that the burial ground that is next to my house was actually a ground for kids. Big yikes. I know that my parents did all they could to put those spirits back to rest when they inevitably accidentally dug them up. But I think about that girl from time to time, and I really wonder just what her story was. If I think of any other stories that I might be able to add here, then I'll add them later. But as for that, this was my story. I'm hoping to gain understanding or possibly relate with some people on here if there are any. But thank you for listening, and I look forward to what you guys think may have happened to me. This happened a few years ago when I was bartending in college. I was coming home down a stretch of divided highway at around 3 a.m. when I noticed a car heading towards me in the wrong lane. I sort of doubted myself at first and thought the car was on the other side of the highway. Sure enough, the white Ford sedan passed me at a really high speed, at least 90. It's worth noting too for later that I also drive a white Ford sedan. Now, I was used to drunk or idiot drivers in the middle of the night, so I just pulled to the side of the road and let him pass me. I had a moment of clarity and thought to call the police, thinking this person could hurt themselves or somebody else. The dispatcher answered, and after telling them which road and exit mile marker I was at, told me that they would send a car. The state police station was only a few exits away, so I figured that they would send somebody and I would just drive home. As I headed back onto the highway, I noticed some lights a few miles behind me. I live in a more rural part of southeastern PA, and traffic at 3 a.m. tends to be truckers and cops. The car gained on me as I was getting up to speed, so I stayed in the right lane and waited to be passed. But instead, they flipped on their high beams, making it uncomfortable to drive, and rode my tailgate. At this point, I thought that I was being pulled over by the police. I drove a white Ford sedan after all, and had just called about a different white Ford sedan, so I grabbed my registration from my glove box. Suddenly, though, the car behind me audibly slammed on the brakes and stopped in the middle of the highway. They must have shut off their car, though, because the lights went out, and I saw what looked like the same Ford sedan from earlier. Still, I thought this may have been a police car, though. They had a roof rack, and it could have looked like I reached for a gun or something in my glove box, so I panicked and called 911 for the second time and asked the dispatcher if they had sent a cruiser to investigate. The dispatcher was a little curt with me this time and assured me that they had sent somebody out. "Listen, we've sent a trooper out to find the car, sir." "Well, I only asked because somebody's following me and acting weird. It could be a cop, and I think I freaked them out by getting my registration." "Are you pulled over?" No, I don't think so. They didn't turn on their lights. Let me try to get the trooper we sent out." As she was talking, the car again sped towards me and stopped inches from my bumper this time. Again, their high beams were on, and again they slammed their brakes. I told the dispatcher I'm pretty sure this is not the police behind me. The car sped to my bumper again and turned their high beams on, this time laying on the horn. Hearing this, the dispatcher asked me what was happening. "Did you honk? What's going on?" "No, that's the car behind me. I don't think it's a cop, though." "I'll try to get the trooper again, but I don't think that's him behind you." For some reason, this is what really shook me. But before, I was just thinking that I would get pulled over and maybe get a ticket. Up until then, I was going to the speed limit and trying to avoid getting pulled over. I told the dispatcher then, "I don't care if I get pulled over, alright? I'm speeding, and if they put their lights on, then I'll pull over." I started to accelerate, and the person behind me just kept up with me. The speed limit was 55 here, and they kept on my bumper the entire time, but this time they were swerving like mad. I tried to signal for an exit, then bail on it, but they followed. At the next exit, I took the off-ramp and continued onto the on-ramp, and the car behind me followed me the whole time. I thought about trying to go to a convenience store or a gas station, but the dispatcher and I thought that would probably be unsafe. She was calm and talking to another person trying to send police to me. The other person, maybe a supervisor or something, asked if I could drive to the state police station. Realizing that I was one exit away too, I told her that I was coming there, and she said that she would have troopers meet me outside. As I pulled off to the exit, the car followed me. I blew a few red lights trying to get to the police station, and the car tried to pull into another lane to pass me or pull up alongside of me. Once the police station was in view, though, I put on my turn signal, and the car slammed on its brakes again, turned off their lights, and turned into a parking lot. Unfortunately, too, the story ends kind of anticlimactically as I pulled into the police station and met the troopers. The two of them went to find the car, and I stayed with the third trooper. I thanked the dispatcher and her supervisor, and the state trooper escorted me home after taking a statement from me. I was never called to follow up or testify or anything too, so I can only assume that the person never got caught. Back in 1989, I was with my boyfriend Eddie, his best friend, my older sister Angie, and about 6 other people. We had spent the entire day just sort of mudding in the Royal Palm mudflats in Royal Palm Beach, Florida, aka part of the Palm Beach County. I grew up in West Palm Beach. I had never seen anything like this before, or since then too. So after mudding all day, we decided to call it a night and leave. Almost everyone was gone by then, so we all piled into Eddie's truck and we left. Eddie saw a small mud hole and drove through it as one last hurrah for the night, and we got stuck. That small hole was pretty deceptive in the end, and when I say that we got stuck, I mean that we were stuck for literally hours. I was actually pregnant with my first two, so I was steering as the other 9 were pushing. That truck, it just would not budge. We had no choice in the end but to wait until morning for someone to come and pull us out, as we were now on our own. And at about 5 a.m. we decided that we should just relax and try to sleep until someone came through. Eddie, I, and his bestie were in the front. My sister and the other 6, who are still friends with us to this day, piled in the back and started to settle down. We were still making noise too when I heard a strange sound. It was a sort of rumbling growl, and I knew immediately that it was some type of an animal. I told everyone to hush and to listen, and then we all heard it, and it was getting louder and more aggressive sounding. Eddie has a KC light behind his seat, and he popped it out, grabbed it, plugged it in, and lit the night up. And it was at that moment when our world changed forever. All 10 of us, in fact, had our world rocked in a way that we had never expected. This thing ducked down and moved. Everyone was starting to freak out because it was clearly there, but what the heck was it? Then it seemed to get angry, and this thing stood straight up, let out a roar that I can still hear 31 years later, leapt the large bush that it was standing behind, and charged us. You could feel the earth literally shake with every running step that it took. It was easily 8 to 9 feet tall. It was broad and really heavy set. It looked like an extremely large man with hair, not fur. It actually had hair, and lots of it. The KC lit it up, and you could see the clumping of the hair in spots. The smell was absolutely rotten and sour, and being pregnant, I was extremely sensitive to smells at the time, and man, it was bad. We had spent hours, we're talking like 5+ hours trying to push this truck out. They say adrenaline gives you super strength, and man, they were right. Because Eddie turned on his truck and started pushing on his doorframe. His bestie leapt out to his side and did the same. My sister and the other 6 let out screams as they piled out, and then all you heard was this thing running and roaring everywhere. Everyone else was dead silent as they're trying to put everything that they had into pushing this truck out, and with the sucking pop that I can still hear, we were out and they were throwing themselves into the back as Eddie and his bestie jumped in and he floored it. Now, these are woods with tight turns, and we flew around those turns like they didn't even exist. It felt like the devil himself was chasing us, but after we got out and onto the main road, we headed for a gas station to calm down and call our families. When we got there, we all got out, sat with our backs to the wall, and that was pretty much it. We never said a word to each other, just silence. I think we were too raw and scared and just in complete shock over what had happened. I mean, this was all myth. This wasn't real. They don't exist. Yet, there it was. After we all called our parents, we went home, one by one being dropped off and not a word spoken. In fact, my sister and I didn't discuss this until about 5 years ago. We finally opened up that night and have slowly talked to the others too. But 25 years after the fact, and every single one of us that have spoken about it have the exact same story and memory forever burned into our minds. It wasn't cool. It was very scary. And I think the reason that we couldn't talk about it for so long was because our brains were just in denial at first. And then we just didn't really know how to open up about it. Now I look back and I say, yep, we saw Bigfoot. This was a couple of years ago now when I was still in uni, and it happened on a Friday night. I went to sleep, when suddenly around 2 a.m, someone enters my room and asks me if he can sleep next to me. I was sort of semi-asleep and wasn't really aware of what was going on, so I just mumbled and moved to the right side of my bed to let the person have some space to sleep. But 1 minute after that, I opened my eyes in a sort of frightened way because I just realized that deep voice, it wasn't familiar at all. I slowly turned my head and I saw a man who was about 40 staring at me quite disturbingly, and he said something that I will never forget. He said to me, keep sleeping. I like to watch you sleep. Panicked now, I pushed the man out of the bed and ran away as quickly as I could to call the police. Since it was a Friday, we had some party at a friend's house and I was very drunk, and I probably forgot to lock the door when I came back to my house, so the man probably took the opportunity to follow me and enter that night. Unfortunately though, when the police arrived, he was already gone. The stranger just completely vanished. But these days, every single time I go to sleep, I always lock every single door that could lead to my bedroom. When I was in my early 20s and living in Chicago, I really wasn't making much money. But when I found this apartment, it was too good to be true. The top floor of a duplex with 6 rooms for $775 a month. The agent who showed me the apartment stressed to me that the landlords were very religious. I didn't have a problem with that, even if it did sound a little bit ominous. The landlords were an elderly couple that lived downstairs. They seemed okay at first, but then when they saw that I was having my boyfriend over, things started to get really weird. For instance, one day I was in my office writing. I hear a knock at the door. I open it, and it's the old lady from downstairs. But before I can say hello, she says, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" I shut the door in her face. I mean, no thanks. But this was a colossal mistake. So, the house was laid out kind of weirdly. There was a door at the bottom of a flight of stairs that I thought led to a communal laundry room, but after accidentally opening it once, I discovered it led directly into my landlord's living room. And unfortunately, I learned this one the hard way. I was in my kitchen cooking, my boyfriend was at work, and I was by myself when I heard what sounded like the click of a door. Okay, I say out loud. What the heck was that? I didn't really make the connection that it could have been the door that led into their living room, but I walked into the hallway and I look around. I don't see anyone at the end of the hallway. I poke my head into all of the rooms, but there's nobody there. Then I look down the staircase leading to their house, and the neighbor lady is standing there just staring me down. I screamed. She flinched and stepped back into her apartment and swung the door shut. After that, every time that I left the house, I spent every possible moment out of the house after that incident too. I would come back and something would always be moved. A window would be shut. At once, the shower was dripping and my towel was damp. I couldn't lock the door too because, it was technically a door to their house. They were the only ones with the key anyway. But the knocking got so frequent, 3 or 4 times a day, that me and my boyfriend propped up an old mattress so that we wouldn't have to hear it while we slept. The second to last straw, though, was when I opened the door for work and the stairs were completely gone. I physically couldn't even leave my house because there were literally no stairs there. They had been dismantled and were now sitting on their porch. I called them repeatedly, but they didn't answer. Finally, their son came out of the house and explained that they were remodeling their porch. And then he told me that I had to cut through their apartment downstairs. So I descended the stairs and opened the door, and they were both sitting at their filthy kitchen table just staring at me. The phone was in its cradle. They must have heard it ringing, but they just kept staring at me with this blank look on their faces. I crossed their kitchen as quickly as I could, and I left out their back door. A few days later, I came home from my job and noticed that the bathroom floor was almost completely flooded, like somebody left a faucet on or the shower on or something. The old woman, seeing that I had come home, came upstairs and knocked, screaming at me that I had flooded the bathroom and that her son had to come and fix it. I was so exhausted by this point that I just told her, "What the heck? Okay." Her son comes by a few hours later, and he is absolutely off his face on something. I open the door and I tell him that I need at least an hour or so before he comes in, and then he picks something up and swings it at me. It was a huge wrench. I somehow duck out of the way and he stumbles over. I book it down the newly repaired stairs as quickly as possible and call the police. They come by and take down a complaint, but claim that since there was no physical contact, that they can't really do anything. I learn later that the old couple has a daughter on the force. In the middle of the night, me and my boyfriend and several of his friends packed all of our stuff into a Chevy Astro, and we just lived in hotels and a van for a month until we found another house. They never did attempt to contact us again, which, for that, I'm thankful.